Support for this and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
Folks, we still have about 15 minutes before we get started. Does anybody have any questions about anything that's going on or not going on? Or just curious about anything? Will we be open next week? It's day to day. The only thing I know right now, there's supposed to be a meeting tomorrow, I think, between the park and the foundation as to what's going to happen. I can tell you all the parks in D.C. are closed, and someone told me even Arlington National Cemetery is closed unless you're going there for a funeral. So, yeah, all the parks are closed. Yeah, I don't think places like the Lincoln Memorial is actually barricaded. But your Ford's Theater, probably the gift shops, things like that are closed. Yeah.
So this meeting tomorrow is just regarding Gettysburg. It's not the entire system.
Just regarding Gettysburg. Yeah. A visitor did tell me that she was having dinner last night with some friends. And I forget, she said she didn't exactly know what they were talking about, but a guy sitting near them who said he was a Secret Service agent told her tomorrow there's going to be an announcement that the federal government is shutting down. Now,
there's 47 cases in the state of Pennsylvania. That's not a pandemic, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so like I said, that's her saying this guy said he, so you can take that for what it's worth. Yeah.
Well, I know the state department has mandated all non-essential work from home. They did that.
Okay.
And there's interstate. It's by air.
By air, yeah.
A little hard to do by car.
So, yeah, unless you put troopers at every crossing.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
I called Friday before I left home at the last minute because I live in Ohio if the programs were going to be going on this weekend because I wasn't sure.
Oh, I know.
Even though I was ready to leave.
Yeah.
I called and says, are they going to be on this weekend? Well, yes, whatever. As far as they knew then.
Yeah, we still have people calling in today.
Yeah, I called a data check. I mean, I live in Gettysburg. I was going to drive down, find out
the best I can tell you going forward is check with the park website.
I didn't even believe that. I wanted to
Carlton.
Yes.
If they did close, it would just be the building. I mean, you're not going to be...
It would just be the building. The park itself would stay open.
Yeah. Okay.
See, that's what I need to do.
Yes.
Do you have any opinion about that new book on the re-examination of Longstreet, Farr's book?
Oh, Longstreet and Gettysburg?
Yeah. Or Hess's book about Pickett's charge, which I think Longstreet comes out a whole lot better.
Or Hess's?
Yeah.
Well, that came out a couple years ago.
Yeah. No, I said Longstreet comes out a whole lot better than he has in Lost Cause crap.
Yeah. As far as Farrisburg go, it's a good, interesting reading. He doesn't really come out with anything new, but somebody said everything's in one place. That's the big advantage of it. Yeah. But you're right, especially in the last 20 years, there's been a reevaluation of Longstreet. And even Douglas Alpha Freeman, between the Lee biography and Lee's lieutenants, you can tell there's a shift in his thinking as well. Now, Longstreet still comes out pretty badly in relation to Gettysburg, but it's not as bad as what it is in the biography. There's also a story out there that Freeman told another professor that he was in the process of doing a redo of the Lee biography because he felt he had been just to some people. He said, especially Longstreet. Now, that's a one-on-one conversation reported by Glenn Tucker, and there's no third party. So, you can take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, but was there a denial?
What's that?
Was there a denial of what Tucker said?
No. Well, what Tucker said is this professor told him.
Oh, okay.
This is what Freeman told the professor. And of course, Freeman then died shortly after that. And so Freeman wasn't around to deny it. Yeah.
Mr. Carlton?
Yes.
Yeah. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Farr. He was in the Visitor Center a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
He has a book in there now on Longstreet. And he gave me a nice dissertation stating that there were a lot of moving parts on that day with Longstreet and that he's coming out a lot better than he has in the past.
He's starting to come out a lot better. Yeah, that's what we were talking about up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wrote a whole book on it. It's in the Visitor Center.
Yeah, Longstreet at Gettysburg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Very good book.
As I was saying, the big advantage to Farr's book is he doesn't really have anything new, but all the information's in one place. Yeah, that's the main value of the book.
Right.
Yeah. Folks, so we have about 5 minutes in case you have any other questions. I like to sometimes say this is a good chance to try to stump the ranger if you want to.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
On the Soldier and Sailor Memorial here for the Confederacy at Gettysburg and Park, in the back of that, at the base, there's a gentleman by the name of Williamson who's noted as the last surviving Confederate member of the armies.
Yes.
Research I've done indicates he was a child during the Civil War, was ever even in the Confederate Army. Do you have any information regarding that?
Keep in mind that mine was put up, I think, in the mid-'60s. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of claims being put forward for the last Confederate soldier. And he was one of them. We now know that probably the last veteran of the Civil War was Albert Woosnam, the Minnesota Heavy Artillery Regiment.
Right, he's in the monument.
He's on the GAR monument up near the Bryant Farm.
Right.
Yeah, all the other Confederates after that, who claim to be Confederate veterans, have proven to be not Confederate veterans.
Including Williamson?
Including Williams.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. A lot of these guys, they fudge their age a little bit to get the pension.
And the glory, probably.
Well, and the glory, but more for the pension. Not thinking they're going to live to be 90, 95 years old, something like that. And so they get the pension and everything, they had to lie about their age. And now that they've got the pension, they can't come out and admit, oh, I lied about the whole thing, because well, you're going to have to pay the pension back. You know, so, and keep in mind, that's a pension from the state, not the federal government. Yeah.
So you'll be out there tomorrow correcting that volume for us?
That monument, the age of it is now, it's an artifact in itself. So we're not going to change it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the visitation of this center on a typical weekend?
On a typical weekend?
A lot more than currently.
Yeah, a lot more than currently. And there's a lot of reasons for that currently. Part of it's the time of year. Part of it's the epidemic we're going through right now. I don't know what the daily visitation is. Park-wide, last year we had just under 1 million people visit the park. And that was one of the first times since 1959, I think, the visitation had been below 1 million. And everybody's thinking, why is... And visitation at all historic sites have been trending down the last several years. And some people think one of the reasons is they don't teach history in school like they used to. And so when kids come to Gettysburg, their parents are probably dragging them, kicking and screaming to come here. You know. Even a couple of years ago, I had a nephew of mine. Not a nephew, but a cousin of mine. He was in his late teens at the time. He was telling us how he had gone down to Williamsburg. And we said, oh, how'd you like the Colonial Village? He said he never went there. He went to the amusement park. Spent 3 days there. And we said, you spent 3 days in Williamsburg? You never saw the Colonial City? You know, so, I mean, that's what kids want these days. So, I don't know. Have to see what happens. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Good. All right. First of all, on behalf of the National Park Service, let me welcome you to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Ranger Carlton Smith, and I'll be with you for the next, hopefully, 45, 50 minutes. Talking about something unusual, I guess, in that we're going to be talking about the Mexican War. And one reason I chose this topic is that you read in the biographies of all these generals like Longstreet, Lee, Meade, Hancock, they served in the Mexican War. And that's about it. So you don't really find out what did they do in the Mexican War. Where in this particular case, since Longstreet's one of my favorite generals, I decided to look and see what Longstreet did in the Mexican War and how this can play a part in his thinking in the Civil War as well. On the afternoon, or on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, Commander General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, is going to direct his First Corps and Senior Corps Commander, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, to launch an attack across a mile of open field to hit the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. And one of Longstreet's first questions to Lee is how many men is he going to have? And Lee estimates he'll have about 15,000 men. Longstreet's response to that was, General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that though 15,000 men ever arranged for battle, can take that position. And Longstreet's going to get a lot of that combat experience, especially by squads and regiments in the Mexican War. We're going to find out Longstreet's engaged in every major action of the Mexican War, except Buena Vista and Cerro Gordo. Just a brief background. James Longstreet was born in 1821 in South Carolina, educated in the local schools around Georgia, and then in 1833 his mother moved the entire family to Alabama. In 1838, Longstreet receives an appointment to West Point from the local congressman Reuben Chapman, who also just happened to be married to Longstreet's second cousin. Okay? Longstreet will graduate from West Point in 1842. He's going to graduate 54 out of 56, second from the bottom. And Longstreet did admit he was more interested in the school of the soldier than anything else. So in one sense, Longstreet feels better being in the school. I don't want to put this. There's a difference between the school of the fighter and the school of the soldier. And Longstreet's in the school of the fighter. Or being a soldier is the more scientific approach to combat. Make sense? Okay. Now, Longstreet, because he's so far down the list, is going to be assigned to the infantry, the 4th Infantry in particular. But there's no opening in the 4th Infantry for a second lieutenant. So Longstreet receives the brevet rank of second lieutenant, which means he can wear the lieutenant's bars, but he's not being paid as second lieutenant. He's probably still going to be paid as a cadet until he gets that full commission. But he will be assigned to the 4th U.S., which at this point is under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Garland, and stationed at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Missouri. There's actually 8 companies of the 4th Regiment at Jefferson Barracks. Now, it's highly unusual for regiments at this time to be all together. They're usually broken up and sent to various different posts. So to have 8 companies of one regiment in one place is somewhat unusual. But also at Jefferson Barracks are 8 companies of the 3rd U.S. So you have almost 2 full regiments in one place at the same time. And one of the things Longstreet said was impressed on their minds once they got to Jefferson Barracks was never despise your enemy. And that's going to come in handy. From the class of 1843 coming to Jefferson Barracks will be Brevet Second Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant. The commanding officer at St. Louis at this time is Colonel Stephen Watts Kearney. Yeah, I have to remember, his name is Kearney. His nephew pronounces it Carney. Same spelling, different pronunciation. Okay? That's how you can tell if someone's from the north or the south. Because in the north, it's Buchanan. You cross the Mason-Dixon line, it's Buchanan. Okay? So if you're from Buchanan, West Virginia, and you say Buchanan, they know you're a northerner. Okay? So Stephen Watts Kearney is commanding Jefferson Barracks, and he's going to maintain a high standard of discipline, but without vexatious rules or regulations. And because he's got these 2 regiments there, Kearney is going to form the 2 regiments into a school for the purpose of brigade drill. So here's not just the 1 regiment drilling, it's 2 of them drilling side by side. And it was said that the regiment was so thoroughly drilled and disciplined that they gained a reputation throughout the service, which placed them in the forefront of the Army. Longstreet himself felt that routine was strict enough to account for every man to fill his time pretty thoroughly. It was about like that at West Point, where thorough daily drill for the Mexican War was threatening. But he also felt there was plenty of time for rest and recreation. Julia Boggs Dent, Longstreet's fourth cousin, her family home was in St. Louis. This is also going to be the future wife of Ulysses S. Grant. But she specifically remembered Longstreet and other officers at a party she attended on February 22nd, 1844. Now, this was a party for the daughter, Major Richard Bland Lee, the commissary officer at St. Louis. And Miss Dent was near a pair of folding doors, which she remembered a bevy of young officers arrived looking so handsome in their brilliant uniforms with epaulets and aiguillettes and chapeaux in their hands. And she especially mentioned the handsome Longstreet. And that is one of Longstreet's reputations, that he was one of the handsomest men in the Army. And she said at that party he was accompanied by Lieutenant Charles T. Baker of the 6th Infantry, Lieutenant Sidney Smith of the 4th Infantry, Lieutenant Charles Hoskins of the 4th Infantry, Lieutenant George Sykes, who commands the 5th Corps here at Gettysburg in the 3rd Infantry, and a lieutenant from the 6th Infantry named Richard B. Garnett. And many others, she said, all of whom I knew. And Captain Richard S. Ewell of the 1st Dragoons has an observation about all the ladies in the St. Louis area. And he wrote to his brother on August 1st, 1844, "This is the worst country for single ladies I ever saw in my life. They are hardly allowed to come of age before they are engaged to be married, however ugly they may be. Except," he said, "the Miss Garlands. I have not seen a pretty girl or interesting one since I have been here." Now, Miss Elizabeth Garland was engaged to marry Lieutenant George Dees of the 5th U.S. Infantry in September of 1844. And Maria Louisa Garland was said to be engaged to Longstreet and would marry as soon as she came of age. At this time, she was 17 years old. But of course, the Army being what it is, if they wanted you to have a wife, they would have given you one, so to speak. So things are not easy for lovers in the Army. On April 23rd, 1844, for example, Brevet Brigadier General Zachary Taylor is assigned as commander of the 1st Military District with headquarters at Fort Jessup, Louisiana, near the Texas boundary, with what was described as a corps of observation to keep an eye out on the Texas situation. In May of 1844, the 4th U.S. is ordered to Grand Ecole, Louisiana, Camp Salubrity, as part of this army of observation. But Longstreet will receive his promotion to 4th Second Lieutenant on March 4th of 1845, and he's reassigned to Company A, 8th U.S. Infantry, which is stationed at this point at Fort Marion, St. Augustine, Florida, which is now known by its Spanish name, the Castillo de San Marcos. In 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico. And as part of the peace treaty, the Texans were claimed the Rio Grande as the boundary between Texas and Mexico. the Mexicans were claimed the boundary for the province of Texas had been the Nueces River up here. So this hashed area is disputed area. The U.S. Congress will approve the annexation of Texas on March 1st, 1845 by a joint resolution. On July 4th, a Texas convention votes in favor of annexation, and Texas will be admitted as a state on December 22nd, 1845, because the Texans claimed the Rio Grande as the boundary. The United States recognizes that as the boundary of Texas. Follow me so far? Okay. On June 29th, 1845, Zachary Taylor receives orders to move his forces to Texas. The first troops embarked from New Orleans on July 24th and land on July 26th near Corpus Christi. Taylor reaches Corpus Christi by August 15th, and camps are established just west of the Nueces River and the Texas boundary recognized by Mexico. So Taylor's going to set up his camp basically in the disputed area. And on August 6th, 1845, the Army of Observation is renamed the Army of Occupation. The 8th U.S. now assigned to the Army, along with 12 companies of artillery, will constitute the 1st Brigade under Brevet Brigadier General William J. Worth. Longstreet noted, near our camps were extensive plains well adapted to military maneuvers, which were put to prompt use for drill and professional instruction. So Taylor's going to start the school of instruction to get his army ready for anything. But he also said there were many advantages too in the way of amusement. Game on the wild prairies and fish in the broad Gulf were plentiful, and there was salt water for bathing. Because I don't know what salt water bathing is going to do for you, but that's what Longstreet said. He also noted the officers built an 800-seat theater, with the officers taking both male and female rows. On March 9th, 1846, Taylor advanced the Army of Occupation to the Rio Grande. He reaches, by March 24th, 1846, Taylor has reached the road junction from Point Isabel to near the Rio Grande at a place called Palo Alto. On the 28th, he reaches the Rio Grande itself and begins construction of Fort Texas on the other side of the river from the Mexican town of Matamoros. It's at least one historian has stated that among the older officers in the Army, like Zachary Taylor, they had a very poor opinion of the enlisted men. Most of the enlisted men they felt are coming from the dregs of society, and they particularly did not like the foreign element in the enlisted ranks. But apparently those attitudes are changing with the younger officers. Now you're talking about people like Longstreet, lieutenants, captains, who are going to be marching with the infantrymen. And Brevet Second Lieutenant Alexander Hayes, who commanded a division of the 2nd Corps here at Gettysburg from the class of 1844, is going to describe their march routine in a letter home. He said, in open order, with route step and arms at will, our troops gave no evidence to an inexperienced eye of their thorough training. Confidence begets confidence. And so unlimited had it become between officers and men that many privileges and liberties were permitted in the ranks, not recognized in the school of the soldier, in no way impairing the requirements of strict discipline, yet conducing to the comfort and gratification of the men. The military etiquette of West Point would have been shocked at dress of which a description would have been sought for in vain in Army regulations. And this is probably going to be a holdover of what they do in the Civil War. By the time you get to the Civil War, the standard marching was for these guys to march 50 minutes in an hour. Excuse me. March for 50 minutes. Okay? Then take a 10-minute break. While in that 50-minute marching, though, the first 10 minutes or so, they're marching according to regulations. And then after that, the men would be allowed to march at will, which basically means they can take whatever step they want, carry their rifles however they want to. At the right shoulder, they can, at shoulder arms, behind their back, whatever's more comfortable for them. So long as they're staying basically in ranks and can respond quickly to emergencies. That's what the men want. Now, I think that's what Hayes is describing in the Mexican War. So that's probably where a lot of the senior officers get their marching at that time. On April 25th, 1846, and there's the young Lieutenant Hayes. The whole picture here also includes, to Hayes' left, a young Lieutenant Grant. And you can see the difference in height between the two. But on April 25th occurred the Thornton Skirmish. And Longstreet wrote Captains Thornton and Hardy, another name from the Civil War, of the Dragoons, were met at Rancho Casitas. Now, I apologize if I pronounce that wrong. By a large cavalry force and some infantry under General Tion, who took captive or killed the entire party. Captains Thornton and Hardy and Lieutenant Kane were made prisoners. The other commissioned officer of the command, George T. Mason, of my class, refused to surrender. Being a superior swordsman, he tried to cut his way out and was killed. And Mason will be the first of Longstreet's classmates to be lost during the Mexican War. In his report of this incident to the War Department, General Taylor said, hostilities may now be considered as commenced. So if you want to know the official cause of the war for Mexico, it's the Thornton affair. Taylor, having started the construction on Fort Texas, decides to fall back with the bulk of the army to Point Isabel to secure his supply base. And on May 3rd, the siege of Fort Texas is going to begin, with Mexican artillery fire from across the river at Matamoros. Taylor's going to start to fall back towards Fort Texas, and on May 8th, 1846, he's going to engage the Mexican army at Palo Alto. Now, I should put these armies in perspective for you. The American army at Palo Alto is 2,400 men. The Mexican forces number 3,400. Okay? James Johnson Pettigrew's brigade here at Gettysburg numbered 2,400. So that puts the American army in perspective. Okay? And this is primarily an artillery duel. No real infantry charges, anything like that. There are some cavalry charges and one cavalry charge on the American left against Duncan's batteries is helped stopped by the 8th Infantry. So that's Longstreet's first taste of combat. The Mexicans withdraw from Palo Alto. I should also point out that Palo Alto is the only national park to commemorate the Mexican War, because that's the only one in U.S. territory. Okay? There's some actions in California, but they're state parks. not national parks. Okay? So if you're ever in Texas, there's another national park you can visit.
If they're open.
But the Mexicans fall back to a place called Resaca de la Palma. And all this green you see, that's chaparral, tall desert grass growing. And the Resaca is simply a riverbed, basically is what it is. In the dry season, it's going to be dry. So the Mexicans on the south side of the Resaca, with a battery guarding the main road heading down to Fort Texas. The 8th and 5th U.S. are going to be on the east side of the road, and the 3rd and 4th U.S. will be west of the road. General Taylor is going to order Captain Charles May of the 2nd Dragoons to lead his squadron down the road in a direct attack on the Mexican guns. And this is Taylor's main tactic. He's not a strategist. His main offensive move is a straight-ahead frontal attack. And that's what May is going to do. But there's a great story surrounding this whole thing. May actually writes up to Lieutenant Randolph Ridgely of the 3rd U.S. Artillery. And May, because of this tall grass, can't really see the Mexican guns. So he writes up to Ridgely, and he says, "Hello, Ridgely, where's that battery? I'm ordered to charge it." And Ridgely said, "Hold on, Charlie, till I draw their fire, and you will see where they are." And that's what happens. Ridgely opens fires, the Mexicans respond, May sees the smoke, and goes charging down the road in a column of fours to attack the Mexican guns. He overruns the position, but because they're down here at a full charge, he can't start the charge until they're about a quarter mile past the guns. And because it's cavalry, he really can't keep the guns once he's taken them. He has to withdraw. So Taylor now orders Colonel Belknap, take those guns and by God keep them. The 5th and the 8th U.S. are now ordered to take the guns. And Longstreet remembered as May made his dash, the infantry on our right was wading the lagoon. A pause was made to dip our cups for water, which gave a moment for other thoughts. Mine went back to her, whom I had left behind. I drew her daguerreotype from my breast pocket, had a glint of her charming smile, and with quickened step, mounted the bank in time to send some of the mixed infantry troops to relieve May of his charge of the captive knight. Even though May didn't capture the guns, who couldn't keep the guns, he had captured General Romulo Diaz de la Vega. That's the captured knight Longstreet's talking about. Now, oddly, in his memoirs from Manassas to Appomattox, Longstreet only goes into the Mexican War up to Resaca de la Palma, and that's it. And he said the reason for that, he says, "I have gone thus far into the Mexican War for the opportunity to mention two valued friends, whose memory returning refreshes itself. Many gallant, courageous deeds have since been witnessed, but none more interesting than Ridgely's call for the privilege to draw upon himself the fire that was waiting for May." Now, Ridgely would be killed later in the Mexican War. May stayed in the U.S. Army and retired in 1862. For his victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, Taylor at first was made a brevet major general as of May 28, 1846. And then on June 29, 1846, he's made a regular major general in the U.S. Army. He'll occupy Matamoros, Mexico on May 18th. Longstreet's going to be named company commander of Company A, 8th U.S. Infantry in June of 1846. Still a second lieutenant. The U.S. Army is going to occupy Camargo on the road to Monterrey and begin the march to Monterrey, Mexico in mid-August of 1846. By September 19th, 1846, the U.S. Army, now numbering about 6,200 men, will reach the outskirts of Monterrey. The 8th U.S. is assigned to the division now commanded by Brigadier General William Worth. The Mexican defenders number about 7,000 regulars and roughly 3,000 militia. On September 20th and 21st, Worth is going to be sent to the west side of the city to cut the main road coming in from Saltillo, where any Mexican reserves might be coming up. His division numbers about 2,000 men, and besides the regulars, he also has Colonel Hayes' regiment of mounted Texans, which is going to come in handy. Once he closed the main road to Saltillo, he then attacked the fortifications on the west side of the city. Federation Hill, he's going to take that first. And then he's going to be taking on Independence Hill. The Texans and regulars would take Federation Hill, and then Worth organized an assault on Independence Hill with 470 men. Longstreet in the 8th U.S. aids in the assault of Independence Hill and captures Fort Libertad with a bayonet charge, and the Mexicans fall back to the Bishop's Palace. Longstreet helps to lead an assault and a capture of the Bishop's Palace, and now they can look directly into the town of Monterrey. The next day is going to be even tougher, though, as bad as these fights were, because now the Mexicans can fall back into the city of Monterrey itself. Longstreet is now going to be involved in street fighting, and he's advanced with 4 companies and 2 6-pounders on the northern route into the city. So here's where Longstreet's going. Now remember those Texans they have with them? What's remarkable at this stage of the battle and the war is that, of course, the U.S. regulars have no training in street fighting. This is not exactly something taught at West Point. So they have no experience. They have no clear idea what to do. But the Texans had fought the Mexicans in that intervening years between independence and being a state. And they have fought the Mexicans in towns. So the Texans knew to go into the buildings, and a lot of these buildings have common walls, smash through the walls until you can get onto a roof that overlooks the Mexicans' position. And then you can fire down on them. And that'll clear them out of there. And then you can move on. So the Texans knew how to avoid open spaces and not to advance directly down the narrow streets of the town. And that's going to stop you. Even a young engineer named Lieutenant George Gordon Meade is going to comment, had we attempted to advance up the streets, as our poor fellows had done previously, all would have been cut to pieces, and we were more skillfully directed. The Americans were advanced towards the center of town and eventually captured Monterrey itself. General Taylor then agrees to an 8-week armistice with the Mexicans, something the administration is going to repudiate. But by November 16th, 1846, Americans have occupied Saltillo. And on or about December 25th, Longstreet is placed in independent command of Saltillo. That's according to one source I have. And he's there until February 5th, 1847, when he leaves to rejoin his regiment at Lobos Island. Major General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the Army, has now been ordered by the President to mount an amphibious operation against Veracruz, Mexico, and try to move inland from there to take Mexico City. And Scott is ordering almost all the regular units from Taylor's army to join him. So Longstreet's ordered to report to his regiment to Lobos Island for the landing at Veracruz. And here's Lobos Island. The troops will land at Veracruz. On February 23rd, 1847, Longstreet's promoted to first lieutenant. So now he's starting to move up a little bit. But on March 9th, Scott will land roughly 10,000 U.S. troops on the beaches near Veracruz. And then he's going to conduct a siege. The city will surrender on March 29th. Because this was a siege, there's no real fighting. So Longstreet's not going to get any combat experience in Veracruz. But Scott then, when Veracruz falls, Scott will now start his advance towards the Valley of Mexico and Mexico City, following basically the same route followed by Cortez in 1519. There's basically one way to get to Veracruz, from Veracruz to Mexico City. So that's what they're going to follow. One thing that could stop them is Mexican forces posted at Cerro Gordo. And a battle breaks out there on April 17th and 18th. By the 18th, U.S. forces are going to rout the Mexicans from the stronghold. The 8th U.S. is held in reserve, so again sees no real action at this battle. But with this sky is now clear to move on to the Valley of Mexico and Mexico City itself. The first engagement here is going to be the Battle of Churubusco. Roughly 8,500 Americans and 2,600 Mexican defenders. The main combat centers around the convent of Churubusco, which was actually a monastery founded by Franciscans. And among the Mexican defenders at the convent is the Foreign Legion of St. Patrick, better known as the San Patricio Battalion. And the San Patricios are basically deserters from the American Army who have joined with the Mexicans. Now, one of the stories is the reason it's called the St. Patrick Battalion is almost all the members were Irish. They weren't. There were Irish in there, but there's also French, German, and several other nationalities. But for the most part, deserters from the American Army. And they do not want to surrender to American forces. Apparently, 2 or 3 times the Mexicans tried to put up the white flag, and the San Patricios pulled it down. But eventually the convent is going to fall, and the San Patricios will have to surrender. But Longstreet's not involved in the fighting at the convent. He's involved in the fighting sort of behind it and to the right at what's called a Tete du Pont. And this was a fortified position covering the crossing of the Churubusco River, which is now a major thoroughfare in Mexico City. And Brevet Major General William Worth is going to comment. The 8th Infantry, although from its position coming up last, by the zeal and energy of its commander, Major Wade, and by the circumstances of the ground, which impeded the advance of other and proximate corps, found itself in position to render most gallant and effective service. The companies of Captain James Bonford and Carlton Smith, under the direction of Brevet Major Wade, preceded by Adjutant Longstreet, colors in hand, were led on most bravely to the assault of the Tete du Pont. Crossing the ditch under heavy fire of musketry, they mounted the rampart and finished the work with a bayonet, closely supported by the 5th and detachments of other corps. And Major Wade, commanding the 8th Infantry, wrote, "The officers who assisted in the attack on the fort and whose conduct came under my personal observation were Brevet Major Waite, Brevet Major White, Captains Bonford and Smith, First Lieutenant and Adjutant Longstreet, and Second Lieutenant Snelling and Pickett." Yes, the George Pickett. So here he is in the Mexican War. Captain Bonford and Lieutenant Longstreet, with the color of the regiment, entered the fort nearly together and planted on the walls of the fort. The gallant conduct of these officers on this occasion, as well as during the whole of the action, deserves the most favorable notice. For his actions at Churubusco, Longstreet received the brevet commission of captain on 20 August 1847. The convent itself is still there. It now houses the National Museum of Interventions. So it covers the American invasion in 1847, the French invasion in 1862, and the American incursion into Grata Pontevilla about 1917. So that's what the museum talks about today. So talk about a little different perspective on things. On September 8th, 1847, we fought the Battle of Molino del Rey. Worth sent an assault column of 500 men from the 8th toward the Mexican line supported by the forces. Now, I don't have any detailed reports of what was going on. But again, Longstreet must have been in the thick of it, because he's now going to be promoted to brevet major for gallant and meritorious conduct to date from September 8th, 1847, the date of Molino del Rey. The next target is going to be the Hill of the Grasshopper, Chapultepec. This is a 200-foot hill with the military academy on top of it. Now, the buildings, though, are not artillery-proof, and the Mexicans have not completed defensive measures to protect the hill. It's estimated they needed 2,000 men to adequately defend the hill. They actually have only about 830, and that's it. But in between all this, the Army has some legal technicalities to work out, if you will. And it has to do with the San Patricio Battalion. Because now, starting on August 23rd, 1847, will be the trials of the San Patricio deserters. The first trial, as this is starting August 23rd, at Tacubaya, will be under the presidency of Brevet Colonel John Garland as president. One of the judges is going to be Captain Robert E. Lee. And they're going to hear 43 cases altogether. A second court at San Angel heard 28 cases. But one of the cases coming up before John Garland is that of Sergeant Abraham Fitzpatrick, a career soldier with a fine record in the Seminole War and on the frontier. His case was heard September 7th. He was accused of desertion from Company A, 8th U.S. Infantry, Longstreet's company. And he claims, like most of them, that he had been captured and sort of drafted into the San Patricios. That's why he was there. He does personally surrender to Longstreet on about August 30th, 1847. And Fitzpatrick is actually going to call Longstreet as a character witness. And Longstreet vouched for his good record and said, I have not known a better non-commissioned officer. It didn't help. Fitzpatrick is going to be convicted and sentenced to an honorable death. Instead of hanging, they're going to put him in front of a firing squad. Okay, that's his honorable death. This particular court condemned 41 of 43 deserters. The other court condemned all 28. Now, General Scott, as the commanding general, has to review all these trial records. And in the end, he upheld the death sentences for 50, pardoned 5, and reduced 15 execution orders. Fitzpatrick himself, because of his previous good conduct, was reduced to private and returned to his regiment. And that's the only punishment he received. So he kind of lucked out. The battle for Chapultepec would now take place on September 13th, 1847. According to the report of Brevet Major William Montgomery, commanding the 8th Infantry, Lieutenant Longstreet was wounded while assaulting Chapultepec and went in the act of discharging the piece of a wounded man. He was always in front with the colors. His high and gallant bearing won the applause of all who saw him. After Lieutenant Longstreet fell, Lieutenant Pickett took charge of the regimental colors, had them borne the first to the top of the palace, lowered the enemy's standard, and replaced it with that of the 8th Infantry and the national flag, while the battle was yet raging below. Also on September 13th will be the execution of the deserters. Now, 30 of them are bound and facing towards Chapultepec. And by orders of the executioner, basically, when the American flag became visible on the fort, that's when these 30 men are going to be hanged. So the last thing they see is the American flag on Chapultepec. But now the battle for Mexico City, in a sense, is just beginning. Because now the Army has to advance along 2 causeways to get into the city. Worth up here in the north and Pillow down here in the south. By September 15th, the city is going to surrender. And General Scott will enter the plaza and take up residence in the National Palace. Longstreet, meanwhile, with several wounded comrades, was assigned quarters with the Escadons, a kind-hearted, refined Mexican family. They could not conceal their deep chagrin at the defeat of their army and were doubtless mortified by the enforced presence of the wounded Americans. Nevertheless, they insisted that those officers confined to their beds be supplied from their own tables. Delicacies without stint were set. The days of confinement are greatly brightened by their delicate attentions. Longstreet's going to be ordered home on sick leave, and he leaves Mexico on December 9th and rejoins his family in Alabama. It was also reported that after reaching home, Longstreet soon regained his strength. He then wrote to Colonel John Garland of Virginia, his late brigade commander, asking for his youngest daughter. Colonel Garland promptly replied, "Yes, with all my heart." The young lady and her soldier already had a pretty good understanding of the subject, and her answer was equally flattering. Their marriage took place on March 8, 1848, at the home of the Honorable James Garland, Louisa's uncle, in Lynchburg, Virginia. After a honeymoon, Longstreet was ordered on recruiting duty to Poughkeepsie, New York. But Longstreet's connection with the Mexican War isn't quite over, because he's now being called as a witness in another court-martial, this one involving Major General Gideon Pillow, the same Gideon Pillow at Fort Donelson, if you remember him. And General Scott has charged Pillow basically with conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. In his reports, Pillow is claiming more things than what he actually did. And that's what the whole thing's about. In one charge, just one charge, well, first of all, the court-martial had convened originally on March 13th, 1848 in Puebla, Mexico. It was adjourned on April 21st and reconvened on about June 5th, 1848 in Frederick, Maryland. So that's where Longstreet is going to give testimony. And among other things, Pillow had claimed to have personally disarmed and killed a Mexican officer at Churubusco. And Scott called Longstreet to testify that this didn't happen. The court later ruled that Pillow may have shot at the guy, but the officer was actually killed, as the police would say, by person or persons unknown. So Pillow kind of got off on that charge a little bit. But Longstreet will be in garrison at Jefferson Barracks from 1848 to 1849. As finally relieved as adjutant of the 8th U.S. on July 1st, 1849. He then serves as chief of commissary for the Department of Texas from 1849 to 1851. And he will serve on frontier duty in Texas at places like Fort Martin Scott and lead several scouting expeditions against the Apaches. He'll finally be promoted to captain on December 7th, 1852. But promotion in the Army is slow, and Longstreet has a growing family. So he decides to leave the line and take a position with the Paymaster Corps with the rank of major, serving first at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then in 1859, transferring to Albuquerque, New Mexico territory. And it's at Albuquerque that Longstreet will resign his commission on July 1st, 1861. Longstreet will serve as the senior lieutenant general in the entire Confederate Army. He did serve in various federal offices after the war until his death in 1904. And he did receive a pension for his Mexican war service. Okay? Because he was an Army officer at that time. But it is in the Mexican War that was served Longstreet's main combat experience prior to the Civil War. I think many of his ideas on leadership are developed during the war itself. He would come to know how to lead soldiers in combat and get to know their needs. He served as adjutant, getting to know all of the Army's paperwork involved in running a regiment. And as chief of commissary for the Department of Texas, he learned how to supply troops in the field. His wife, Louise, died on December 30th, 1889. Longstreet would marry Helen Dorch on September 8th, 1897. He was 76, she was 34. She was born in 1863, the year of Gettysburg. And to advance the story a little bit, she'll pass away in 1962 at the age of 99. She was hoping to hit 100 and almost got it. But then he decided to honeymoon in Mexico. And the second Mrs. Longstreet wrote, after 50 years, General Longstreet found that many of the physical details of the battle terrain in the Valley of Mexico differed quite materially from the memory conveyed his younger eyes in the heat of action. There was no real change in fixed landmarks, but the depressions were not so deep, nor the impregnable hills the Americans attacked so high. as they appeared when the Mexicans were defending them with sword, musket, and cannon. She went on to say, in instance of supreme danger, it is very difficult for the soldier or subordinate officer to see things exactly as they are on the battlefield. His eye and mind are inevitably and anxiously concentrated on the enemy or the battery that is dealing death and destruction round about. I want to thank everybody for joining me this afternoon for the talk. Those of you who have questions and want to stick around, I'll be here for a few minutes to answer questions. Those of you who don't want to stick around for the question and answer session, feel free to leave whenever you want to. But I do want to thank everybody for showing up today for the program. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
It's refreshing to hear that George Pickett wasn't a successful infantry assault that you mentioned.
Yes.
Any interaction with Longstreet and, say, Lee?
Hey, Lee?
In Mexico, Grant? Or other?
Or Grant serving in a different regiment. So he's not really with Longstreet. Lee is an engineer on Scott's staff. So the only contact he and Longstreet might have had was at Fitzpatrick's court-martial. And John Garland might have said, yeah, that guy's engaged to my daughter or something. That was probably as far as it went. But that might be the first time Lee saw Longstreet. So at the court-martial. Now, George Meade did meet Lee in Mexico. They were both engineers.
You mentioned Sykes.
George Sykes.
Yeah.
I think Sykes was in California. So I don't think he was in the Mexican War. I know William Sherman was in California.
Fifth Corps commander.
George Sykes.
Sykes,
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Did I understand you to say that Lee was the judge on the court-martials for many of the alleged deserters?
Lee was the judge on the court held by John Garland. Garland's the president. Lee is one of the 12 judges.
Okay.
I'm not sure who the other 12 judges were.
At court-martials at that time, were those judges and juries, or was the judge...
Just like today. Well, no, I take it back yet. John Garland he's the presiding officer.
Does he decide the sentence, or did Lee?
Collectively. They're going to decide the sentence. It's probably a majority vote, something like that.
Okay.
And so without going into the court-martial record, if they even recorded it,
right,
it's hard to tell who voted what.
Sure.
But certainly the U.S. Army, in the case of the San Patricios, was not in a very forgiving mood. And that's understandable. These guys deserted, and they're responsible for a lot of the casualties
Sure.
of the American Army at the convent,
Sure.
particularly.
Yep.
Yeah. There is one gruesome story. Scott found about 5 guys or so who had deserted before the war started, before war was declared. So technically they deserted in peacetime. And execution is not a penalty for peacetime desertion. So they had to wonder which was worse. Those 5 guys got 50 lashes on the bare back and were branded with a D underneath the cheek, close to the eye, but not close enough to damage the eye. And reportedly, General Harney, who was overseeing everything, found one guy where the letter D had been put on backwards. So he insisted they put it on correctly on the other cheek. So, yeah. And of the 30 guys that hanged facing Chapultepec, again, General Harney was out there overseeing everything. He went up, he only counted 29. He said, where's the other guy? And the surgeon told him, but the other guy had his legs blown off, and he's in the hospital dying right now. And Harney said, I'm directed to hang 30 men. I'm going to hang 30 men. So he dragged that guy out of the hospital, put him up, and hanged him. So that's the tough guys we're talking about who didn't like enlisted guys. It's people like Harney. Yeah.
What was the nature of Longstreet's Mexican War wound? And did it,
He was wounded in the thigh.
Okay. Did it bother him? Did he say anything about it?
Didn't seem to.
Okay.
Yeah, he recovered pretty well from it. The wound he does not fully recover from is the one in the wilderness. That's the one that came up through the back and exited the throat and severed the nerves to his right arm. So he lost the use of his right arm, and his voice had to drop to a whisper. And where before that, his voice could be heard along the whole battle line. But now it's just a whisper. And in 1904, Longstreet came down with a case of pneumonia. And his constant heavy coughing of that reopened the old war wound. And that's what did him in. But he died 2 days short of his 83rd birthday. So kind of a tough old bird, you could call him. He lived almost 42 years after the war. Still serving his country. He was U.S. Railroad Commissioner at the time. Anything else? All right. Once again, I want to thank you folks for coming today, and good luck with everything.